Alright, in today's video I'm going to talk about Final Fantasy XIV. I did a video on Final Fantasy XIV earlier this year where I went more in depth. I'll leave a link to that video on the info card top right. But for today's video I'm just going to talk about Final Fantasy XIV and share my thoughts about this incredible game. And holy shit has this game taken over my life this year. I never expected an MMO to be this good. And this is coming from a guy who pretty much gave up on MMOs back in the day. And trust me, I've tried many MMOs, from World of Warcraft to your typical Korean MMO. Don't get me wrong though, the concept of MMORPGs sounds cool on paper, but I couldn't really get around the genre or get far into those types of games. Even as a Final Fantasy fan, I was looking the other way whenever I saw anything related to Final Fantasy XIV. I've said this before, but I had this weird edgy stigma back then towards Final Fantasy XIV where I was like, no thanks, I only play real mainline Final Fantasy games. So what makes Final Fantasy XIV so special, you might ask? Well, one of the things that I like about this MMO is that it contains a lot of single player RPG elements, especially when it comes to the story quest or the main story quest as they're called. I've heard people say that playing Final Fantasy XIV is almost like playing a single player RPG that also has a well-running MMO aspect to it, and I couldn't agree more. It is very story driven like your typical Final Fantasy game, but it's also an MMO. The world of Final Fantasy XIV and the story is so engaging, and because of that it made me enjoy my journey from level 1 and all the way to max level. They have clearly put a lot of emphasis on the RPG part of the MMO genre, and I've even seen people calling it an RPG MMO, and I can see why. Now that I think about it, Final Fantasy XIV might be one of my favorite Final Fantasy games out there. Lately it seems like Square is focusing more on linear types of experience that leans heavily towards action-based gameplay when it comes to mainline Final Fantasy games, compared to like old school Final Fantasy that felt bigger in scale. Now Final Fantasy XV might be an exception in terms of scale, but that game dropped off heavily and became linear as you progress further into the story. Now I personally don't mind the direction they're heading for this franchise because I really enjoy Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I also love JRPGs that combine an engaging story with a big world to explore, games like Xenoblade Chronicles for instance. And I think Final Fantasy XIV has a perfect blend between having an engaging story and a massive world that actually feels alive. Now Final Fantasy XIV has more or less become a main game since 2019, and even though I finished the main story so far, there's still a lot of content for me to enjoy. Final Fantasy XIV is filled with content outside the main story, and the best part about them is that you can do them at your own pace. The game is designed in a way that respects your time. Right now I'm doing Borjan Southern Front, which is like a post-game area with its own leveling system and raids where you can grind for one of the best weapons in the game. It also has a really interesting story, especially if you're a big fan of Ivalice and Final Fantasy XII. Besides that, I've also been doing a lot of crafting as of late, and it is really addictive. The fact that they're treating crafting and gathering like a class is just amazing. They have their own abilities, gears and stats. I mean, that in itself is just fucking mind-blowing. Now that I think about it, the game is like a buffet. One day I'm leveling all jobs, doing dungeons and raids, and on other days I'm a botanist traveling across the world of Final Fantasy XIV to gather stuff for crafting. But yeah, Final Fantasy XIV is loaded with content for you to dive into. And right now we're seeing a lot of new players trying out Final Fantasy XIV thanks to streamers like Asmongold and many more. It is fun seeing so many new players, but I'm also worried that the service might be a bit too congested. Endwalker is coming in November and we're probably going to see even more players and longer queue times. Hopefully they'll manage to do something about it. But yeah, I had to make another video about Final Fantasy XIV because I've been having so much fun playing this game. If you're playing Final Fantasy XIV, let me know your thoughts about this game in the comment section. There's also a free trial that contains 100+ hours of content for those that are interested in trying it out. But yeah, thank you for watching this video. Consider subscribing if you're interested in JRPG related stuff. More videos are coming, so take care and I'll hopefully see you guys next time.